The Mexican Council on Foreign Relations presents Coyuntura Comexi. In this episode, Russia and Eurasia, the Russian world concept, power, and foreign policy. A conversation with Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff, Senior Associate Non-Resident at the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program, CSIS. What is the Russian world concept, and how would you say the idea of empire helps explain Russian foreign policy and actions in Ukraine?
So the Russian world concept has been around for a while, and its boundaries are somewhat fluid, but it basically suggests that Russia and the idea of Russianness is not confined to the borders of the Russian state, and that various other people, because of their history, language, culture, political affiliation, or whatever, have some kind of formal connection to Russia, and that Russia reserves for itself a right to exert some kind of protectorate over these people, irrespective of where they live. Again, the boundaries of this Russian world have changed and are fluid. It's a concept that can be invoked to mean different things at different times. At some times, it is constructed to include, for instance, people far outside of Russia who have an appreciation for Russian culture, let's say. Most of the time, though, it refers to people in the former Soviet Union who were influenced directly by Russian culture and have some history of political tie to Russia. And it's an imperial concept because it suggests that the sovereignty of states within which these people live, Ukraine or Belarus or the Baltic states or wherever, isn't absolute. That even though a person may be a citizen, let's say, of Belarus or Ukraine or Latvia or take your pick, that doesn't mean that that state is the only one to which they, in some sort of ineffable way, belong. But by virtue of their inclusion within this Russian world, that they also have some connection to Russia, and that therefore Russia has a right to intervene in whichever state they're located to quote unquote protect their rights. I should add one other thing about this concept, which is that it is often connected to the outlook of the Russian Orthodox Church. So it has a kind of philosophical or ideological component to it, in that it's held to imply support for quote-unquote traditional values that the Orthodox Church promotes within Russia. And this is a discursive element that the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church have mobilized to promote things like nuclear families, hierarchical gender roles, opposition to same-sex marriage, to gender fluidity, and various other concepts that the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't support. And it means, as a political tool, that when Russia seeks to influence or intervene in the affairs of other states because of their supposed belonging to this Russian world, that it often seeks to do so on the basis of this ideological narrative, that it supports groups and individuals and movements that espouse this worldview that is also associated with the Russian Orthodox Church.
Is this idea of empire related to the Soviet era or the Tsarist Russia era? Aside from power, what is the end goal of promoting this Russian world?
Again, because it's a somewhat fuzzy concept that can get shifted depending on how it's being employed, it's not always clear. I think in practical terms, it's primarily applied to populations that lived in the former Soviet Union, albeit not uniformly. So it's certainly much more visible in terms of Russia's approach to a country like Ukraine, let's say, than to a country like Tajikistan. And that has to do, I think, with cultural propinquity, the perception in Russia of where these countries fit, relatively speaking, in this, how close they are, how close they're seen as being to Russia. So Ukraine is much more important from the perspective of Russia, from the perspective of this Russian world ideology than say is Tajikistan. But it applies primarily within the borders of the Soviet Union. So it's not applied with as much vigor, let's say, to somewhere like Finland or Poland, which was part of the Russian Empire but not part of the Soviet Union, or not, long part of the Soviet Union. That said, the language itself, the imagery, is much more that of the Russian Empire. It's much more about the Russian Orthodox Church, traditional figures from imperial Russian history, like Peter the Great, who Putin has invoked as a model for what he's seeking to accomplish. Catherine the Great. So it's these figures more than it is figures from the Soviet period. But of course, the borders, the kind of mental map of where this Russian world is, looks more like the Soviet Union than it does the Russian Empire. In terms of what it is that people who are promoting this vision seek to accomplish, well, I think you hit on it with the idea of power. It provides them a justification, or at least a self-justification, for seeking influence within the borders of other states, for claiming that people in these other states in some way belong to Russia, and that Russia has a right to exert influence over them. It's not just about those states, though. Again, I think the emphasis on quote unquote traditional values is important in all of this, because it suggests that what Moscow, the Kremlin, the Orthodox Church see as the Russian world is in some ways counterpoised to the liberal, open, modern world. And that the appeal in part is based on encouraging people who, for one reason or another, are uncomfortable with that modern world and its uprooting of hierarchies and its emphasis on personal choice and individual identity and individual responsibility. It's giving those people a place to go, a place to look, to associate themselves with a more collective mindset based on hierarchical power, gender, and other kinds of relations. And so for certain populations, not just in the former Soviet Union, but outside, this vision is appealing for a variety of reasons having to do with their own loss of status in this more open, complex world that now exists.
From what you have described, this Russian world concept sounds like a conservative, orthodox, European version of Russia. Does it really reflect the Russian population? What does it mean in domestic terms and in other countries in the former Soviet territory that may not mirror this idea as clearly?
First, let me start by saying that the ethnic Russian share of the population of Russia is about 80%, 79-80%. So it is a majority, significant majority of the Russian population, of the Russian Federation's population. But ethnic minorities in Russia are often territorially concentrated in particular regions, especially the North Caucasus, but places like Tatarstan, Bashkortostan on the Volga, or Altai, Yakutia, Buryatia in Siberia, and how these populations relate to this concept of a Russian world is a really good question. As much as the Orthodox Church is a driving force behind all of this, Russia does have a law and religion that recognizes so-called traditional religions, and the Russian Orthodox Church is first among equals among these. But at the same time, there are Muslims, Jews, and Buddhists in particular are also recognized as being traditional religions. And there are official hierarchies in Russia for Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. And these hierarchies are similarly mobilized to support this vision of a Russian world that is based on so-called traditional values. It's been striking to see since the start of the war in Ukraine, the chief rabbi of Russia left the country, gave up his post and left the country. He published a piece in the New York Times a couple of days ago where he basically said he was told that he needed to come out in support of the war and sort of mobilize Russia's Jewish population on behalf of the war effort, and he refused to do it, and so the only option for him was to leave. But I think this is emblematic of the strategy that the Russian state has employed, where it is this vision of Russia that they adhere to is one that is primarily targeted to, I don't know that in the Russian context the term white makes sense, but to the Slavic Orthodox majority population, but one in which other groups can be brought in as well, even if on a sort of secondary basis. Now, that said, I think it's important here to note what Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about Russian identity, because in a lot of ways, I think he's the main sort of intellectual influence on the way that Putin and others in his circle think about what it is to be Russian and what this Russian world is. So Solzhenitsyn wrote in the early 1990s, distinguishing between the sort of Slavic parts, or the East Slavic parts of the Soviet Union and the rest. And he argued that as an empire, the Soviet Union was illegitimate and that it should not have a problem giving up the non-Slavic regions, so the Baltic states, the South Caucasus, and most of Central Asia. But that the East Slavic regions, so Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and then he would also talk about Moldova, and he didn't specify Moldova, but a lot of his contemporary followers also look at Moldova, and at least the northern part of Kazakhstan, which is ethnic Russian majority, as being part of this greater Russian space. And he argued that for Moscow, for Russia, to integrate these regions or these publics wouldn't be an imperial act at all, because they were historically part of the same cultural, political, moral, religious milieu. So I think it's important to keep that distinction in mind, because for people like Putin, Ukraine, or seeking to take over Ukraine, is not seen internally as being an imperial act the same way that, say, seeking conquest in the Caucasus or Central Asia would be. Ukrainians, most of them don't think the same way. They reject this worldview out of hand, and that in a lot of ways is what this war is about. But I do think that view of the Russian world and its sort of prioritization of the East Slavic Orthodox communities, regardless of whether they live in the state borders of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, or elsewhere, is important to this whole story. It's not consistent. And I think that's also important to keep in mind here. There's not like a clear roadmap for what this looks like that anybody's laid out. It's a sort of jumbled mishmash of resentments and emotional appeals and kind of sentiments more than it is a concrete political program.
How would you describe the most recent events in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, and how does it affect the balance of power in the region?
I think the South Caucasus kind of occupies a different place in this Russian mindset, if you will. Yes, the notion of the Russian world can be applied because you have people who were part of the Soviet Union, who have a kind of Soviet cultural complex. And this was invoked in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia, let's say. That was the justification, right? Or it was protecting Russians, Russian speakers, and compatriots was the way it was described, the justification for Russia's war in Georgia. With Armenia and Azerbaijan, it's less straightforward. You mentioned the European Union, but I think the big outside player here is actually Turkey. And Russia's involvement in the conflict is in part about trying to limit the scope of European involvement, but it's also part of its larger geopolitical relationship with Turkey, which now encompasses not just the South Caucasus, but a lot of the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and elsewhere. But Russian involvement in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan goes back to the beginning of that conflict at the last stages of the Soviet Union. And during the first phase of this conflict, there were Russian forces involved on both sides. By the end of the first Nagorno-Karabakh war in 1994, Russia had de facto sided with Armenia. And as a result of that, has had a long-standing troop presence on the ground in Armenia that the Armenian leadership and Armenian public are not particularly happy about, but don't have a lot of options for doing anything about. Over the course of the last decade or so, Turkey has become a major player in the region through its patronage of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan rearmed, built up its military largely on the basis of military technical cooperation with Turkey. There's close cooperation between the military commands. Turkey was involved in a pretty explicit way in the fighting in 2020 when the Nagorno-Karabakh war flared up again. And what that means is that Azerbaijan has an external patron that is not Russia, that it can lean on for support. At the same time, because Azerbaijan's a major energy producer and it has signed agreements on supplying energy to the EU, it also has support there, and it has money that it's used to build up its military. So there's now a real imbalance of power between these two countries, and that's been reflected in the most recent fighting, both in 2020 and then the upsurge in the last couple of months, where Azerbaijan has continually retaken territory that it lost during the first war in the 1990s, and then carried out attacks even across the border in undisputed Armenian territory more recently. Russia is constrained in its ability to do much about this, in large part because of Azerbaijan's alignment with Turkey, but also because Russia doesn't want to completely sacrifice its own influence with Azerbaijan. What it doesn't want to do is be put in the position of having to patronize Armenia against Azerbaijan. What it wants to do is to maintain a kind of balancing role where it's able to influence both sides. And that has meant, in this particular context, that it has had to step aside and sort of allow the Azerbaijani attacks to play out, not create additional complications with Ankara, and force Armenia to realize that it doesn't have a lot of choices, that it can protest to Moscow all it wants, but at the end of the day, nobody else is going to protect Armenia from these attacks. And so it has to accept a kind of unfavorable relationship with Moscow.
Regarding the recent flare-up in the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan conflict, what is its regional relevance in the current context?
Well, I think, similarly with Armenia, Russia has troops on the ground in both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and that's a legacy of the Soviet collapse. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it had these bases already, particularly in Tajikistan, and that base was built up in the 1990s when there was a civil war in Tajikistan, and the Russian footprint is still there. It's mostly about maintaining stability in the region, kind of protecting the frontier from the spillover effects from Afghanistan, which became a big concern in the 1990s and hasn't really ceased. But at the same time, Russia has used its presence on the ground, as it has in Armenia, to shape political outcomes in the region. I think, unlike the situation in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, there's not a long-running conflict here. There's not a frozen conflict. There's a border dispute between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan because the border hasn't been fully demarcated, and the lines that were drawn during the Soviet period are really messy and complex, and if you look at a map, seem to make absolutely zero sense. At the same time, you have political leaders in both Bishkek and Dushanbe who are appealing to domestic audiences, who are trying to stoke nationalist sentiment for their own political benefit. And that has given them a reason to play up the salience of these conflicts. And that was the driver of fighting that occurred last year, as well as the upsurge in violence on the border in September. For Russia, there's not as much experience here managing this conflict as there is the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, because again, it's not a long-running conflict. Russia does have a presence on the ground. It does have significant political influence in both countries, although that's being challenged. And it has pulled some of its forces out to send them to Ukraine, so it has less of a presence on the ground, but it's still there. And following the most recent upsurge of fighting between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, Russia, along with many others, was pushing for a ceasefire. And, I don't know what incentives it was able to deploy against either of the governments, but there does now seem to be something of a ceasefire in effect.
Within the context of this conversation, how do you think Russia will focus its actions on the immediate term, and how would you characterize its position in the region?
Obviously, Ukraine is where all the attention is going to be concentrated. The war seems to be entering something of a critical phase right now, as Russia suffered some pretty serious reverses in Kharkiv last month. Now in Kherson, and it looks like increasingly in Donetsk as well. At the same time, there were the so-called referenda that Russia carried out in the partially occupied regions, so Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which now it's claiming are Russian territory. But it doesn't have actual physical control in these areas and is losing ground, especially in Kherson and in Donetsk. So what that is ultimately going to lead to is hard to say, but I think that's where the focus of the attention is going to be. Of course, Russia's called up significant numbers of conscripts that it's struggling to mobilize and to deploy. That will have some effect. It may have a significant effect within Russia in terms of escalating social tensions and forcing some kind of shift in the approach towards the conflict, whether that leads towards escalation, whether that leads towards push for a deal, whether that leads to political change at the top, is really hard to foresee at this point, unfortunately. I think as far as the rest of the region goes, there's a sense that Russian power is retreating, that Russia is weakened by this conflict and less capable of playing the role of post-imperial hegemon that it's been accustomed to play in both the South Caucasus and Central Asia. And so there's likely to be more attempts to shape facts on the ground, whether by Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, others potentially as well. But I see this conflict in Ukraine as kind of accelerating the erosion of post-Soviet Eurasia as a sphere of Russian influence.